She threw my duffel bag off the porch while her guests watched through the window. 10 years, 2 deployments, 3 commendations nobody in that house would ever frame. And my sister, standing in the doorway of the mansion my father built, looked me up and down in my soaked jacket and said it like she was commenting on the weather. Loser. The door locked. The party resumed. I picked up my bag, walked down the driveway, and didn't look back. Not because it didn't hurt, because I had somewhere to be. And what was waiting for me at the end of that road was going to change everything for both of us. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. The rain started somewhere over Ohio. I know that because I was watching the window of the Greyhound bus the way soldiers watch perimeters, not looking for anything specific, just maintaining awareness of the space between me and whatever came next. I had been on that bus for 11 hours. Before that, a connecting flight from Dulles that smelled like recycled air and other people's anxiety. Before that, a transport out of Bugram that nobody cheered for and nobody filmed, because that is the part of military service that doesn't make the recruitment posters, the going home part, which turns out to be its own kind of combat that they don't give you a manual for. My name is Sarah Miller. I am 34 years old. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan over a decade of active duty, and I came home on a Tuesday night in November with a frayed backpack, a duffel bag, and exactly the kind of bank account you accumulate when you have spent your 20s in places where there is nothing to spend money on. I had $400 in checking. I had a discharge certificate in a manila folder. I had 3 commendation letters that I kept not because I thought anyone would ask for them, but because throwing them away felt like deleting a version of myself I had worked too hard to earn. That was the full inventory. The bus pulled into the station at 11:14. I checked my phone out of habit, the same reflex I had developed overseas for checking conditions, checking signals, checking whether the world had shifted while you weren't looking. No messages. Not from Tiffany. Not from anyone. I opened the rideshare app. No drivers available in this area. Of course, I put my phone back in my pocket, shouldered both bags, and stepped out into a November storm that hit me like a statement. Pennsylvania rain is not polite. It doesn't mist or drizzle. It commits. Within 30 seconds, my jacket was soaked through at the shoulders, and I was walking down a road I hadn't been on in 4 years with the particular kind of forward momentum that has nothing to do with energy and everything to do with the absence of alternatives. I want to tell you about Tiffany before I tell you about that night, because the words she said to me on that porch did not come from nowhere. Words like that have architecture. They are built over years from smaller materials, dismissals, redirections, the steady accumulation of moments where one person decides the other one doesn't quite register as a full human being. Tiffany Marie Miller is 3 years younger than me, which means she was born into a family where I had already established the template and she had decided early and permanently that she wanted no part of it. I was the serious one, the quiet one, the one who read manuals for fun and helped my father in the garage on weekends and got straight A's without broadcasting it. Tiffany was the one who understood, at approximately age 9, that charm was a more efficient currency than effort. She was not wrong about that. I will give her that much. She was brilliant in the specific way that people are brilliant when they understand social architecture before they understand anything else. She knew which teachers responded to warmth and which responded to precision. She knew which friendships to cultivate for access and which to maintain for appearance. She knew, by the time she was in high school, that visibility and value were not the same thing, but that most people couldn't tell the difference, and that this confusion was exploitable. Our father, Daniel Miller, watched all of this with the quiet attention of a man who understood what he was seeing, but had not yet decided what to do about it. My father was not an emotional man in the conventional sense. He did not give speeches at dinner, or sit on the edge of beds asking about feelings. He expressed himself through precision, through the way he maintained things, repaired things, documented things. His workshop was immaculate. His filing system was architectural. He kept records the way other men kept grudges, carefully, completely, and with an eye toward future utility. He had built Miller's Fuel from a single-pump roadside station in the early 80s into a modest, but functional business that sustained our family through my entire childhood. It was not glamorous. It smelled like oil and rubber and the specific exhaustion of manual work. But it was his completely and without debt by the time I was in high school. I loved that place the way I loved my father, quietly, without needing it acknowledged. Tiffany had moved out at 19, which is to say she had moved into a series of increasingly strategic living situations funded by increasingly strategic relationships until she landed at 26 in the lakeside house. I should explain the lakeside house. Our father had purchased the lakeside property in the mid-90s, a 4-bedroom on the water outside of town. More house than a gas station owner had any obvious business buying, which was a detail I filed away and did not examine until much later. He had maintained it as a rental for years before eventually moving into it after my mother passed. When I enlisted at 22, my father was living there alone, managing the rental history of the property with the same meticulous energy he applied to everything. When I came back on leave 3 years in, Tiffany was living there too. When I came back 2 years after that, Tiffany had redecorated. When I called from overseas 2 years after that, the way Tiffany spoke about the house had shifted from staying with Dad to something that sounded more like ownership, and I noticed that shift the way you notice a vehicle drifting into your lane. Not with panic, but with a quiet adjustment of attention. My father died 14 months before I came home for the last time. Pancreatic cancer, which announces itself late and moves fast, and which I found out about via a phone call that reached me on a base outside Kandahar on a Wednesday morning that was simultaneously completely ordinary and the worst morning of my life. I requested emergency leave. The paperwork took 11 days. The funeral happened on day 8. I arrived on day 12 to a house that had already been cleaned out and a sister who said, standing in the driveway with her arms folded, "You missed it. You missed all of it." She was not wrong about the timing. She had made sure of that. I need you to understand something about grief and military service that doesn't get discussed in the spaces where people talk about veterans coming home. The war doesn't stop when your father dies. The mission doesn't pause for personal loss. You absorb it, you file it somewhere internal. You continue functioning, because the alternative to functioning is a kind of collapse that has consequences for people around you that you are not willing to accept. So I absorbed my father's death at 12,000 feet of altitude in a country that had no space for it. And I filed it somewhere very deep. And I kept going for 14 more months, and the whole time I kept going, I held one thought in the back of my mind like a compass point. I am going home. I want you to drop in the comments right now. Where are you watching this from? I genuinely want to know, because this story has been reaching people I never expected, and what I am about to tell you next is something I think more of you will recognize than you might expect. The night I arrived, the night of the storm, the night of the porch, I had not eaten since the airport. I had not slept in approximately 30 hours. I was carrying the full physical and psychological weight of a decade of service, and a grief I had not yet been given space to hold. And I walked up that curved driveway in the rain because it was the only address I had. I could see the light from the windows before I reached the door. Warm, golden, expensive. Music underneath the sound of the rain. The kind of evening that costs money to assemble and costs more to maintain. I rang the bell. Footsteps. The door opened and Tiffany stood there in a dress that cost more than my monthly service pay. And her face did the thing I have since come to understand was its default setting when confronted with something that complicated her narrative. It fractured, just for a half second, and then it composed itself into a performance of mild annoyance wrapped in the language of concern. "Oh my God," she said. Not relief, not welcome, just the particular tone of someone whose evening has developed an inconvenience. I said, "Hi, Tiff." She looked at me the way you look at something that has arrived in the wrong context. The wet jacket, the frayed backpack, the duffel, the boots that had walked on ground she had never seen and would never understand. Behind her, the living room held approximately 20 people in the kind of clothes that do not get worn. They get curated. And every single one of them, in the moment she opened that door wide enough to reveal me, had a clear view of exactly what the Miller family looked like from the inside. She did not step aside. She stepped out, pulling the door half closed behind her, which told me everything about the priority structure she was operating from. The conversation on the porch lasted 9 minutes. I know because I have played it back in my memory so many times I have memorized its exact dimensions. She told me my timing was impossible. I told her I had just come from a war zone. She told me I could have gone to a hotel. I told her I had $400. She laughed, not warmly, the other kind, and said, "So after 10 years of serving your country, you're broke." I said, "I wouldn't frame it that way." She said I would. Then she reached inside, picked up a document from the entry table, and handed it to me in the rain. The summary of my father's will. The lakeside property to Tiffany. Miller's Fuel to me. I stared at it. She said, "He was very deliberate." Then she went inside. The door locked with a sound that was very small and very final, and I stood there on that porch in the rain holding a document that told me my inheritance was a rusted gas station while my sister hosted a networking event in the house my father had built. And I felt something settle in me that was not defeat and was not yet a plan, but was something in between. Something very quiet, very cold, very focused. I picked up my duffel from where she had thrown it on the wet lawn. I shouldered my backpack. I turned and walked down the driveway in the dark, and I did not look back, not because nothing had happened, but because I already knew where I was going. And what was waiting for me at Miller's Fuel that night was not the ending my sister had written for me. It was the beginning of something she had no framework to anticipate, because she had spent 30 years underestimating the wrong person. Miller's Fuel sat at the edge of County Road 7. Like something the town had decided to stop arguing with. It wasn't falling down, it was just finished. Finished with maintenance. Finished with ambition. Finished with the particular energy required to keep a place looking like someone still believed in it. The sign above the canopy had lost 2 letters so that it now read Mlers FL. In the kind of font that had been modern in 1987 and had since become its own kind of archaeology. The pumps had been decommissioned, I could tell from the road, even in the dark, by the way the nozzles had been bagged and the display panels gone dark. The lights were dead, every single one. I stood at the entrance for a moment with rain running off my jacket and looked at the place my father had left me and tried to locate what I was supposed to feel about it. Gratitude was not available. Neither was grief, not yet. What I found instead was the same flat functional assessment I had learned to apply to every unfamiliar environment I had ever entered. What is the structure? What are the vulnerabilities? What do I actually have to work with here? I found the key on my keyring. I had never taken it off, not in 10 years, not across 2 continents, and unlocked the front door. The smell hit me immediately. Cold metal, old oil, the particular staleness of air that has been sealed too long and has stopped pretending otherwise. My flashlight beam moved across the interior in slow sweeps. Shelves still stocked with items that had expired during the Obama administration. A register sitting open and empty. Ceiling tiles water-stained in patterns that documented every storm the roof had failed to fully deflect. A rack of road maps for a highway system that GPS had made irrelevant. The counter had a crack running its full length that had been repaired with epoxy at some point and had then cracked again along the exact same line, which told me something about the quality of the repair and something else, maybe about the nature of cracks in general. I moved to the back office. Metal desk, three-legged chair, a filing cabinet with a broken lock. The window had a diagonal crack sealed with tape that had yellowed to the color of old teeth. I sat on the edge of the desk and opened the will summary again, holding my flashlight over it, reading it the way I should have read it on the porch instead of absorbing it like a blow. Miller's Fuel Service Station, including all structures, equipment, and real property associated with the address, to Sarah Elizabeth Miller. The language was clean and unambiguous. No conditions, no timelines, no attached instructions. Just the name and the address and the transfer. I folded it and put it back in the folder and sat in the dark for a while. Then I stood up because sitting in the dark was not something I had ever been good at for long, and I started moving through the building the way I moved through any unfamiliar space, methodically, completely, without skipping corners. The front room, the office, the small bathroom with its broken mirror, the storage room at the back. The storage room was larger than the front of the building suggested it would be, which is a feature of old service stations built in an era when storage was considered as important as display. Concrete floor, metal shelving bolted to the walls, stacked crates, oil drums lined against the far wall. The smell back here was denser, rubber and chemical, and the bottom layer of a place that had been accumulating its own history for 40 years. I moved the crates methodically, looking for blankets, tarps, anything with practical value for a night that was only getting colder. I was 3 crates in when I noticed the floor. I want to explain this carefully because I know how it sounds, and I want you to understand that I was not looking for anything. I was a cold, exhausted woman doing a practical inventory of a building she had just inherited in the dark, and the floor anomaly registered the same way all anomalies register after a decade of training. Not with drama, just with the specific heightening of attention that your nervous system produces when something does not match its context. The far corner of the storage room floor was concrete. All of it was concrete, except for one rectangular section near the back wall where the texture was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just different at the edges, cleaner seams, a faint rectangular outline that the accumulated dust had almost but not completely erased. I crouched and ran my fingers along it. Wood, not concrete. Flush mounted, no visible hinges from above. A recessed handle nearly invisible under decades of grime that I found only because I was running my fingers along the full perimeter and my thumb dropped into the indentation almost by accident. I sat back on my heels and looked at it. My father had built this building, had run it for 40 years, had maintained every inch of it with the precision of a man who believed that things deserved to be kept correctly. And in the back corner of his storage room, under the oil drums he had arranged with slightly more deliberation than was strictly necessary for storage purposes, was a hatch. I moved the drums. They were lighter than they looked, empty, every one of them, placed there not for storage, but for coverage, which my father had done so naturally and so long ago that the dust had settled over the arrangement and made it look accidental. It was not accidental. Nothing my father did was accidental. The handle turned. The hatch opened with a groan that was more about hinges needing oil than about age, which told me the wood was solid, maintained, not rotting. A rush of cooler air came up from below, drier than the room above, which was the first truly surprising thing, because cool, dry air in a basement in Pennsylvania in November means climate control, and climate control means intention. I pointed my flashlight down. Stairs, narrow, wooden, descending approximately 8 feet into a space I could not fully see from above. I went down slowly, one hand on the wall, flashlight sweeping the space as it revealed itself. What I found at the bottom of those stairs is something I have described to two people in my life since that night. My attorney and one other person whose involvement in this story comes later, and both times I described it, I watched their faces go through the same sequence of expressions that I imagine were on mine in that basement. Disbelief first, then comprehension, then something that sits between awe and grief because you are looking at evidence of a person you thought you knew and realizing the dimensions of them were larger than what they showed you. The basement was dry, climate controlled by a dehumidifier unit that had long since died, but whose presence explained the condition of everything around it. Metal shelving, floor to ceiling, lining 3 walls. Organized with the same precision I recognized from my father's workshop, his filing cabinets, his approach to every system he had ever maintained. Boxes labeled by year going back to 1974. Binders with handwritten tabs. Document cases sealed with the kind of archival tape used for long-term preservation. Equipment cases I did not immediately recognize. And at the center of the back wall, on its own shelf at eye level, a fireproof lockbox. Black, heavy gauge steel, the kind rated for both fire and flood. My name written on the top in my father's handwriting. Not Tiffany, not both of us, just my name. Sarah, in the same neat, controlled script he used for everything. Maintenance logs, repair records, the grocery list he left on the counter every Sunday morning throughout my entire childhood. I stood in front of it for a long time without touching it, because I understood in that moment that my father had known I would find it. He had structured it so that only I would find it, left the gas station to me specifically, put my name on the box, placed it at the bottom of a hatch under oil drums in a building that Tiffany had never once in her life shown any interest in entering. He had known she wouldn't come here. He had known I would. And whatever was in that box had been waiting for me with the particular patience of something placed by a meticulous man who understood that timing matters and that the right person, given the right inheritance, would eventually find their way to the right room. I opened the binders first because I am my father's daughter and he taught me to read the context before you open the sealed envelope. The first binder contained property records, not just for Miller's Fuel, for everything. The lakeside house, vehicle titles, account records, investment statements organized by year going back 3 decades. I turned pages slowly, and the picture that assembled itself was not the picture of a modest gas station owner who had done reasonably well. It was the picture of a man who had been extraordinarily careful about what he showed and what he kept. The second binder stopped me completely. Federal contract documentation, government communications, infrastructure, technical schematics with clearance level headers that I recognized not from my father's dinner table conversation, but from my own decade of service. Long-term civilian contractor agreements, system maintenance and upgrade records, Cold War era telecommunications, projects that had continued well into the 90s and beyond. My father had told us he did consulting work. Technical stuff, nothing interesting, he used to say in the same tone he used when he fixed something that had been broken for weeks and then walked away without mentioning it. I stood in that basement holding a binder full of federal contracts and understood that my father had spent his entire adult life doing 2 things simultaneously: being present enough to seem ordinary and being precise enough to be trusted with systems that required extraordinary discretion. And then I found the third binder. Handwritten tab, my father's writing. 2 words that changed the temperature of the room. Personal notes, Tiffany. I opened it slowly. Not accusations. Not the language of a man building a legal case out of bitterness. Observations. Dates. Incidents. A record of his final 2 years written in the same measured, unemotional hand he used for maintenance logs. Visits during which certain documents were moved without his knowledge. Conversations he had documented within the hour they occurred. A pattern emerging across the entries. Access, pressure, isolation, the slow management of a man whose illness had reduced his physical capacity without touching his mental clarity. A final entry, 3 weeks before he died, in handwriting slightly less controlled than the rest, but no less precise. I am not certain Tiffany understands the difference between winning and taking. Sarah will. Sarah always did. I closed the binder, set it back on the shelf, stood in my father's vault at 2 a.m. in a storm that was still going, and understood that the gas station was not a consolation prize. It was not the lesser inheritance. It was the key to everything, and my father had left it to the only one of his daughters he trusted to understand what to do with it. The lockbox was still waiting on its shelf, my name still on the top, and whatever was sealed inside, it was going to change the architecture of everything my sister believed she had already won. I opened the lockbox at 2:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I checked my phone before I touched the latch, the same reflex I had developed in the field for timestamping anything that might later need to be accounted for. The combination was my enlistment date. I did not know that immediately. I tried 3 combinations before I reached it, and the fact that my father had used that specific date out of every number available to him is something I have not yet fully decided how to feel about. The box opened with the particular solidity of something well-made and well-maintained, the kind of mechanism that rewards the right person with a clean, unhesitating click. Inside, resting on a layer of acid-free archival material that my father had clearly researched and deliberately sourced, were 4 items. A sealed envelope with my name on the front, a leather-bound journal, dark brown, worn at the corners in the way of something handled regularly over many years. A set of certified legal document copies held together with a binder clip and labeled in my father's handwriting. Trust instrument, final version. And a smaller envelope, unsealed, containing a single index card on which my father had written 7 words in his cleanest script. Do not open the journal until the letter. I set the index card down, picked up the sealed envelope, and opened it. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten, dated 3 weeks before my father died. I am going to tell you what it said, not by quoting it directly, but by telling you what it built inside me as I read it standing in that basement in the dark, because the content of that letter is not the point. The architecture of it is the point. The fact that a man who had never once in my memory said, "I love you" in those specific words, had spent what must have been the last significant physical effort of his dying body, writing for pages, to make sure I understood something he had never found. The language for while he was well enough to speak it easily. He told me the gas station was not a punishment. He had known, he wrote, that Tiffany would receive it that way, would frame it to anyone who asked as evidence of his preference for her, the lakeside house versus the rusted pumps, the obvious inheritance versus the consolation prize. He had counted on her framing it that way. He had structured the will to produce exactly that interpretation in exactly that audience, because he needed Tiffany to feel she had won before she understood the board. He needed her comfortable. He needed her visible. He needed her standing in the lakeside house hosting networking events, while I was standing in the basement of Miller's Fuel reading the actual document. He wrote, the gas station was never the inheritance. It was the address. I read that line 3 times. Then I opened the trust instrument. The trust was real, not a fantasy, not the kind of dramatic fictional wealth that makes stories like this feel false. Real, carefully structured, legally executed by an attorney named Daniel Harper, whose contact information was paper clipped to the front page. The assets inside the trust were the product of 40 years of a man living below his means while building above them quietly and completely without audience. Federal contractor income invested conservatively over 3 decades. Property holdings documented in the second binder. A communications patent my father had co-developed in 1991 that had generated licensing revenue every single year since. And that was listed in the trust documents with a current annual figure that made me sit down on the basement stairs and stare at the wall for approximately 90 seconds. The trust had conditions, all of them reasonable, all of them structured with my father's characteristic preference for systems over sentiment. Legal protection of estate assets, stabilization funds for transition, a designated allocation for veteran and community initiatives that my father had named specifically, which told me he had been thinking about what I would want to do, not just what I would need to survive. And a final condition written in the last paragraph of the instrument in language slightly more personal than the rest. The trust activates fully upon legal confirmation that all estate assets have been properly disclosed and accounted for. I read that line the way you read an instruction that contains more information than its surface. My father, the meticulous man, the keeper of records, the documenter of observations, had built a trust that could not fully activate until someone confirmed the estate was clean. And he had left the binder labeled personal notes, Tiffany in the same room. He was not a vengeful man. I want to be precise about that because it matters for understanding everything he built. He was a structural man. He did not plan to punish Tiffany. He planned to create conditions under which the truth would emerge through the correct channels at the correct time with the correct documentation already in place. He had not left me weapons. He had left me a position. And positions in the right hands at the right time are more powerful than any weapon that has ever existed. I opened the journal at 4 a.m. My father's handwriting covered every page in the same controlled script. Dated entries going back 11 years. Not a diary. He was not that kind of man. More like a captain's log. Observations, decisions, reasoning. The early entries documented his diagnosis, his assessment of his own prognosis, his decision not to tell anyone until he had finished organizing what he needed to organize. He had lived with the knowledge of his illness for 14 months before telling Tiffany. He had not told me directly because I was deployed and he had made a deliberate calculation that the information would compromise my operational effectiveness and that there was nothing I could do from where I was that would change his medical outcome. That calculation was cold and it was wrong and it was also completely consistent with who he was. And I have made a separate piece with it that is not the subject of this story. The entries that documented Tiffany's behavior during his illness were the ones that changed the temperature of the room. Not accusations. He was incapable of that register. Documentation. Dates and times and exact conversations recorded with the precision of a man who had spent decades maintaining systems that required accurate logs. The pattern across those entries was clear and consistent and deeply familiar to anyone who has ever watched a person with resources become the target of someone who has mistaken proximity for entitlement. Tiffany had begun moving documents within 6 weeks of learning about his illness. Not stealing, nothing so crude. Repositioning, files that had been in his office appearing in different locations. Account statements going to a P.O. box she had helpfully offered to manage. Conversations about the will in which she had gently, repeatedly, conversationally introduced the idea that the lakeside house was already functionally hers, that she had been managing it, maintaining it, that the transition would be simpler if the paperwork simply reflected what was already the reality. My father had documented every conversation. He had also quietly removed every document of consequence from the location she had access to and placed them in the location she would never go. Because Tiffany had never once in her adult life entered Miller's Fuel. She found it ugly and beneath her, and she had said so at family dinners with the particular confidence of someone who has never considered that the things they dismiss might be the things that matter. Now I need to pause here because I want to ask you directly. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your location in the comments because this story has been reaching people in places I genuinely did not expect. And what I am about to tell you about the week that followed is the part where I stopped being a soldier processing a loss and started being my father's daughter executing a plan. I contacted Daniel Harper on a Thursday morning. I had found his number paper clipped to the trust documents, and I called him at 8:15 from the office at Miller's Fuel. Sitting at my father's metal desk with the trust instrument open in front of me and the journal beside it, and the particular clarity that arrives after a night without sleep when your body has given up on rest and your mind has simply kept moving. Harper answered on the second ring. He was a mid-50s probate attorney with a voice trained to remain neutral under pressure, and I could hear that training working overtime as I described what I had found and where I had found it and how long it had apparently been waiting for me. He asked whether anyone else had been in the storage area recently. I said no. He asked whether I had removed anything from the basement. I said I had taken photographs of everything and touched only the lockbox and its contents. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Ms. Miller, I need you to understand that what you're describing has significant legal implications for the current estate distribution." I said, "I know. That's why I'm calling you first." Another pause, the kind that contains a recalibration. He said, "Can you come to my office tomorrow morning?" I said, "I can come this afternoon." He said, "Yes, please do." 2 days after I met with Harper, he connected me with a forensic accountant named Margaret Klein. Precise, efficient, the kind of professional who translates financial complexity into clean, undeniable language that courts can follow without interpretation. Margaret requested full financial disclosure on all assets currently associated with the estate, including the lakeside property. What came back over the following week assembled itself into a picture that was both surprising and, in retrospect, completely logical given everything I now knew about the gap between my sister's visible life and its actual foundation. Tiffany was not wealthy. Tiffany was leveraged. The lakeside house carried a mortgage near maximum valuation. It had been refinanced twice in 4 years. The lines of credit attached to her business accounts had been extended aggressively and were being serviced at the minimum threshold. The income streams from her digital brand consultancy were inconsistent, strong visibility, weak liquidity, the financial profile of someone who had mastered the appearance of success so completely that even their bank statements read like content. Margaret showed me the summary across her desk with the flat effect of someone who has delivered this kind of information many times and has learned that the most useful thing she can do is simply present it without editorial. She tapped a highlighted section and said she's solvent only as long as nothing destabilizes her image or her access to these credit instruments. She looked up. Either one becomes compromised and the structure collapses quickly. No drama, just math. I drove past the lakeside house once that week. Fresh landscaping, a new imported SUV in the driveway, a delivery truck from a catering company parked at the side entrance. Nothing about the exterior suggested that the woman inside was 3 months away from a financial reckoning she had been building toward for 2 years without understanding the ground was already being removed. I went back to Miller's Fuel and I kept working. Because I had learned something from a decade in environments where the difference between a good outcome and a catastrophic one was almost always preparation, and preparation almost always looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. Harper filed the probate dispute on a Monday morning, and I was not present when he did it because I was behind the counter at Miller's Fuel teaching myself how to run a point-of-sale system from a YouTube tutorial on my phone, while an electrician I had hired with trust funds properly documented and properly allocated restored power to the building one circuit at a time. That is the part of stories like this that rarely gets told. The part that happens in between the discoveries and the confrontations, the part where you are just a person doing the unglamorous work of rebuilding something while the legal machinery you have set in motion runs its course without you in the room. The filing was a formal probate dispute with a request for judicial review of withheld estate documents and a motion for full financial disclosure of all assets associated with the Miller estate, including, but not limited to, the lakeside property, its mortgage instruments, refinancing history, and any accounts or credit facilities secured against it. Harper had also filed simultaneously and through a separate instrument a preservation order on all financial and communication records associated with the estate. What this meant in practical terms was that Tiffany could not move money, transfer assets, refinance further, or restructure any of the financial instruments attached to the lakeside property without court notification. The ground had been staked. She just did not know it yet. I had also authorized Harper to execute the second element of the trust instrument, the one I had been turning over in my mind since the night I read it in the basement. Among the assets my father had documented in the trust was a secondary lien note tied to the lakeside property. A lien that my father had held quietly for 11 years, originating from a private loan he had extended to the original seller that had transferred with the property through a mechanism so understated and so precisely documented that it had never appeared in any of the conversations Tiffany had managed during his illness, because she had not known to look for it and he had not volunteered it. The lien did not give us ownership of the property. My father had not been building towards seizure. What it gave us was leverage, the specific, legal, procedural kind that has no drama attached to it and no weakness in it, the kind that simply exists in the record and cannot be dismissed or argued away, because it was filed correctly and has been sitting in the county records for over a decade waiting for someone to activate it. Harper activated it. What this meant in Margaret Klein's flat, precise language was that any attempt by Tiffany to sell, refinance, or further leverage the lakeside property would trigger a mandatory resolution of the lien before any other transaction could proceed. It meant her financial flexibility, already thin, already stretched to the membrane, had just been reduced to approximately nothing. And it meant that every bank, every credit officer, every financial institution she might turn to for relief would now see a flag on the property that would require explanation before any conversation about assistance could begin. We were not foreclosing. We were not attacking. We were doing exactly what my father had structured us to do, applying precise, legal, documented pressure at the exact points where the structure was already weakest and waiting for physics to do the rest. I want to tell you about the electrician. His name was Pete Garza, 51 years old, third-generation County Road resident, the kind of man who showed up exactly when he said he would and charged exactly what he quoted and did not fill silences with noise. He had known my father. He told me this on the second day, not as an opening for a longer conversation, but as a statement of context, the way people in small Pennsylvania towns establish coordinates before they do business. He said, "Your dad was a good man, kept to himself, paid on time." I said, "Yes." He said, "He used to come in here sometimes just to check on the building, even when it wasn't open. Just walk the perimeter, check the roof, make sure nothing had shifted." I said, "That sounds right." Pete nodded and went back to the wiring. I thought about my father walking the perimeter of a closed building in the middle of the week, checking the roof of a gas station he had stopped running, making sure nothing had shifted, making sure the hatch was undisturbed, making sure the vault was intact, making sure the position he had built for me was still exactly where he had left it. By the end of the second week, Miller's Fuel had power, full lighting, functional register, refrigeration unit running in the back. I had cleared the expired inventory and replaced it with a practical selection sourced from a wholesale supplier Harper had connected me with through a trust-approved vendor relationship my father had apparently set up years earlier. I had repaired the front door hinges, replaced 2 ceiling tiles, and had a conversation with a roofing contractor about the water damage that he had concluded was less extensive than it looked and could be addressed in a single session. The sign still read MLERS FL because I had decided that particular repair could wait. Word had traveled the way word travels in small towns through the specific mechanism of people who notice things and mention them without being asked. The Miller girl was back. The soldier, living at the gas station, fixing it up. I heard this characterization from 3 different customers in the first week, and each time I heard it, I thought about the way my sister had said those words. Loser, cautionary tale, 10 years chasing meaning in a desert. And I noted the distance between her vocabulary and the one being used by people who had watched my father maintain this building for 40 years and understood instinctively what it meant that his daughter was doing the same. Tiffany arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I had been expecting her not on that specific day, but in that general window, because the probate filing would have reached her attorney within days of submission, and her attorney would have called her, and her first response to any pressure she did not understand would be to drive to the source of it and perform confidence in its direction. She stepped out of the SUV in designer sunglasses and the kind of coat that costs enough to be its own statement, and she stood at the edge of the lot and looked at the building with the expression of someone who has arrived expecting to find ruins and is slightly disoriented by evidence of function. I was outside when she pulled in, working on the canopy drainage with a wrench and a level. She walked toward me with her heels clicking against the concrete in a rhythm that I recognized as deliberate. The same rhythm she had used since we were teenagers to announce her presence in a room before she had decided how to occupy it. She looked at me in my work jeans and my father's old flannel jacket and said, "Well, this is tragic." I tightened a bolt. She circled closer. "I assumed you'd be gone by now." I said, "I'm busy." She said, "With what?" "Rebuilding the last century." I said, "Something like that." She moved around to my left and stood with her arms loosely folded, the posture of someone affecting casualness while performing surveillance. She looked at the new lighting visible through the front window, the clean glass, the restocked shelves, the sign on the door indicating current hours. Something moved through her expression that was not quite readable, not concern exactly, more like the first registration of an anomaly that she had not yet decided how to categorize. She said, "You're actually doing this." I said, "Yes, living here. For now." She laughed softly and shook her head, the performance of someone who finds something both pitiful and faintly amusing. "Dad would have wanted better for you." I looked at her then, directly, fully, without adjustment. I said, "Dad was very specific about what he wanted for me." Something flickered in her face, quick, almost invisible. But there, the specific micro-expression of a person who has just heard a sentence that contains more than its surface and is trying to determine how much more without revealing that they are trying. She recovered quickly. She said, "The attorneys have been in touch." I said, "I know. This probate challenge is going to accomplish nothing except running up fees for both of us." I said, "Harper is thorough." Her jaw tightened. "Sarah, the will was executed legally. My father was of sound mind." I said, "I agree completely." She blinked. That was not the response she had prepared for. She said, "Then what exactly are you challenging?" I said, "The completeness of the disclosure." Silence. The kind that has a specific texture. The texture of a person recalculating in real time while attempting to project a surface that is not recalculating at all. She said, "I don't know what you think you found." I said, "I know you don't." She stared at me for a long moment. I held her gaze with the same flatness I had used for a decade in rooms where showing uncertainty was a structural liability. Then she said, quietly and with an edge that was different from her usual register, less performance, more actual, "You have no idea what I dealt with. Those last 2 years, alone, managing everything, making decisions nobody else was there to make." I said, "I read about it." She went very still. I let that land. Then I went back to the bolt I had been tightening and said, "Drive safe, Tiff." She stood there for another 4 seconds. I counted, the way you count anything that matters, and then she walked back to the SUV and left without another word. I watched the vehicle reach the road and turn and disappear. Then I put the wrench down and took out my phone and sent a single text to Harper. She came. She knows something is wrong, but she doesn't know what. How long until the lien notification reaches her bank? His response came back in 6 minutes, already processed. They'll contact her within 48 hours. I put the phone back in my pocket and picked up the wrench. 2 days later, the calls started. Not to me. I was not a party she could reach directly for anything that mattered. To Harper, to Klein, to the bank's loan management division, to the credit facility that handled her business accounts. I know the calls happened because Harper documented them in his case notes, which he shared with me at our next meeting in the flat. Factual tone of a man reporting field conditions. Tiffany had called Harper's office 4 times in 2 days. The calls had progressively shorter hold tolerances and progressively less strategic framing. By the 4th call, she was asking questions that revealed the precise shape of what she did not know and what she did know and the narrowing gap between those 2 things. What she knew, a lien had been activated on the property. What she did not know, how, from where, on what authority, and what it meant for her refinancing application that she had submitted to the bank 3 weeks prior, the one she had been counting on to extend her financial runway through the following year. What it meant, the application had been flagged pending lien resolution. The runway she had been counting on did not currently exist. Klein called me on a Friday afternoon to update me on the financial picture, as it had developed over the 2 weeks since her initial analysis. Her voice had the same professional flatness it always had, but there was a precision to the update that told me she had found something she considered significant. She said, the refinancing application revealed a 3rd credit facility she didn't disclose in the initial records. I said, what kind? Business line, secured against projected revenue from a brand partnership contract. A pause. The partnership contract was terminated 8 weeks ago. I said, does she know we know that? Klein said, she will when the bank completes their review. I thought about Tiffany standing in my parking lot in her designer sunglasses, telling me this probate challenge would accomplish nothing except running up fees. I thought about my father's journal entry. I am not certain Tiffany understands the difference between winning and taking. I thought about the hatch in the storage room floor. The oil drums arranged with slightly more deliberation than strictly necessary. The combination lock set to my enlistment date. My father walking the perimeter of a closed building in the middle of the week, checking the roof, making sure nothing had shifted. He had built this position across decades with the patience of a man who understood that the most durable structures are the ones nobody watches being built. I was simply the person he had trusted to stand in it when it was time. And it was almost time, because the following week, an invitation arrived at Miller's Fuel in an envelope so thick and so deliberately designed that its confidence was itself a kind of statement. Cream cardstock, embossed lettering, the Harper Lakeside Foundation annual winter charity auction, hosted at the Miller residence, honoring Tiffany Miller, entrepreneur and digital brand strategist. I held the card for a long time, not because it surprised me, because it confirmed something I had understood about my sister since we were children, but had never seen demonstrated so clearly or so completely. Even now, with a probate dispute filed against her estate distribution, a lien activated on her property, a refinancing application flagged, and a terminated brand partnership contract sitting in a bank's review file. Even now, Tiffany's instinct was to perform, to host, to stand in a room full of people whose opinion she valued and be honored in front of them and collect their validation like a resource she could not survive without. My father had known this. He had structured everything around it. He had needed her to be exactly this visible, exactly this public, exactly this committed to her own performance at exactly this moment. Because the room she was building for herself was the room where everything was going to happen. And I had just been handed an invitation to it. The invitation had not come from Tiffany. That was the first thing I confirmed when I called the foundation's event coordinator the morning after it arrived, a woman named Claire who spoke with the rehearsed warmth of someone paid to make every call feel like the most important call of her day. I asked how my name had come to be on the mailing list. She checked her records and told me the foundation's board had compiled the guest list independently of the honoree, pulling from a database of regional community contributors, veteran service contacts, and local business owners. Miller's Fuel had apparently been in the county business registry long enough to qualify on the third category, and my father had at some point been listed as a regional donor contact on a veteran initiative that the foundation had partnered with 3 years prior. My father had put himself on that list. I sat with that for a moment. Even in the design of this, the invitation reaching me through legitimate institutional channels rather than through Tiffany's hand, my father's fingerprints were present, not controlling the outcome, just arranging the conditions under which the right outcome became possible. I called Harper. I told him about the invitation. He was quiet for 4 seconds, which for a man of his professional composure was the equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. Then he said, "This is the public venue." I said, "Yes." He said, "We can execute the procedural elements there. It's a matter of record, the lien, the probate filing, the bank notification. All of it is already in process. The event simply becomes the location where the process becomes visible." I said, "That's what I want." Another pause. "Sarah, I want to be precise about something. What I do that evening will be entirely procedural. No theatrics, no editorial. I present the legal reality, and the legal reality does the work." I said, "That's exactly right." He said, "Your father would have done it the same way." I did not respond to that immediately because there was something in the way he said it that told me Harper had known my father better than I had understood, and that the relationship between them had been longer and more deliberate than a client-attorney arrangement, and that this moment, this phone call, this plan, this evening was something Harper had been prepared for in a way that went beyond professional duty. I said, "How long did you know him?" Harper said, 22 years. I said, "Did he tell you about the trust?" He said he built it with me. Over the last 11 years. Every revision, every addition, every condition. He was very precise about what he wanted it to do and when he wanted it to do it. I said, "He never told me." Harper said, "He told me you wouldn't need to be told. He said when the time came you would understand the whole structure from inside it." I held the phone for a moment. Then I said, "I need one more thing before that evening." He said, "What?" I said, "I need to know if the journal entries are sufficient for the isolation and document management claims, or whether we need additional corroboration." Harper said, "The journal combined with the bank's own timeline of account changes is sufficient, but I have something else." He paused. "Your father gave me a sealed envelope 14 months ago with instructions to open it 30 days after his death. I opened it. Inside was a USB drive containing 47 months of automated backups from his home office computer, document access logs, folder movement timestamps, email records. The temperature of the room changed. I said he documented it digitally. Harper said automatically. He set up the backup system 2 years before he died and never mentioned it to anyone. The files are time-stamped, unaltered, and forensically intact. I said, "Does Tiffany know this exists?" Harper said, "No." I said, "Good." There were 10 days between that phone call and the evening of the auction. I want to tell you exactly how I used them, because I think the how matters as much as the what, and I promised you I would not leave out the details. I spent the first 3 days completing the exterior repairs on Miller's fuel that I had been working through systematically since my arrival. The canopy drainage, the pump island resurfacing, the parking lot line repainting that I did myself on a cold Saturday morning with a roller and a chalk line, and the specific satisfaction of a task that shows its results immediately and completely. Pete Garza came back to finish the secondary electrical panel and stood in the parking lot afterward looking at the building with his hands in his pockets and said, "Looks like it used to." I said, "Better than it used to." He almost smiled. I spent days 4 and 5 at Harper's office reviewing the procedural sequence for the evening of the auction, not the emotional sequence. Harper was clear that emotions were not part of the plan and did not need to be prepared for. The procedural sequence, the order in which the legal documents would be presented, the language Harper would use, the personnel who would be present, the specific moment in the program when the intervention would occur for maximum legal clarity and minimum confusion about what was happening and why. Because confusion, Harper had explained at our first meeting, is the enemy of consequence. When people are confused, they look for exits, narratives, someone to blame the confusion on. When people understand exactly what is happening, they cannot look away from it and they cannot reassign it. We wanted the room to understand. We spent days 6 on what I was going to wear. I am including this because I think it matters and because I think the reflex to dismiss it as superficial is the same reflex Tiffany had spent her entire life counting on people to have. Appearance is a language. My father understood that. My sister had built her entire existence on it. And I had spent a decade in uniform, which means I had spent a decade understanding that what you put on your body communicates your relationship to the room before you have said a single word. I bought one thing, a tailored black suit, single-breasted, clean lines, no ornamentation. Not expensive in the way Tiffany's wardrobe was expensive, no visible brand, no statement accessories. Just precision. The kind of garment that communicates that the person inside it has decided exactly who they are and does not require the room's confirmation of that decision. I tried it on in the fitting room of a department store in Princeton and looked at my reflection and thought about my father in his cufflinks and his leather journal and the way he had walked into every room of his life with the quiet authority of a man who knew things other people didn't know and had made his peace with the fact that they didn't know he knew them. I looked enough like him in that mirror to make something tighten in my chest that I filed away for later. Days 7 and 8 I spent with Margaret Klein, reviewing the financial summary document she had prepared for Harper's use at the auction. 22 pages, clean and spare as a blueprint, every figure sourced and cited, every timeline documented, every discrepancy between Tiffany's public financial presentation and her actual financial position laid out in language so precise and so unembellished that reading it felt like watching a building's load-bearing walls rendered in X-ray. Klein had also included, at my request, a 1-page summary designed for non-financial readers. Because the guests at the auction were donors, board members, local personalities, people whose primary relationship to money was having it, not analyzing it. I needed them to understand the summary page, not the 22 pages. Klein had written it in 11 sentences. It was the most devastating 11 sentences I had ever read that contained no adjectives. Day 9, I drove to the lakeside house. Not to go inside. Not to confront anyone. I parked on the road at the edge of the property and looked at it through the windshield for approximately 4 minutes. The landscaping was immaculate. The windows were lit. The new SUV sat in the driveway beside a second vehicle I didn't recognize. There was a catering van parked at the side entrance and 2 people in black uniforms carrying equipment through the side door, which meant Tiffany was already staging the event space 2 days in advance, which meant the evening mattered to her in the particular, consuming way that things matter to people whose survival is attached to perception. I thought about the last time I had stood at this address in the rain with my duffel bag on the wet lawn and the door locked behind me and the little summary blurring in my hands. I thought about the word she had used, the particular flatness of it, the almost bored delivery of something designed to cut. I did not feel the anger I had expected to feel sitting outside that house. What I felt was something quieter and more structural. The feeling of a person who has spent 9 days doing the precise, unglamorous, necessary work of preparation and is now 1 day away from the room where the preparation becomes visible. I drove back to Miller's Fuel. I slept 8 hours, which was the most I had slept in a single stretch since returning home. The evening of the auction arrived the way significant evenings always arrive, preceded by an ordinary afternoon that gives no indication of what it is carrying. I closed the station at 4, showered, put on the black suit, drove to the lakeside house. Harper was already in the parking area when I arrived, standing beside his car in the particular stillness of a man who has done this kind of thing before and has learned that the moments before it begins are best spent conserving energy rather than rehearsing. He looked at me when I got out of the car, looked at the suit, nodded once. We did not have a long conversation. Everything that needed to be said had been said across 9 days of preparation. He told me the bank representative had confirmed attendance. He told me the court officer was present as required for the procedural elements. He told me the forensic accountant summary had been delivered to the foundation's board secretary that afternoon as a matter of legal record, which meant it was already in the room before either of us entered it. I asked if there was anything that had changed. He said no. I said, then let's go in. The interior of the lakeside house in full event configuration was, I will admit, extraordinary. My father had built the bones of it, and Tiffany had spent years finishing the surface. And the result was a space that understood exactly what it wanted to communicate and communicated it without hesitation. Warm lighting, flowers at a scale that suggested both taste and budget, a silent auction display along the east wall, round tables dressed in white linen holding centerpieces that probably cost more than Pete Garza charged me for the electrical panel. The guests were already assembled, approximately 60 people in the register of the quietly wealthy, local business owners, foundation board members, a county commissioner I recognized from a newspaper photograph, several faces I had seen in the donor listings Harper had pulled when researching the foundation's financial connections to the estate. Tiffany was at the center of it. She was always at the center of it. She was wearing a deep burgundy dress with the kind of structural elegance that requires significant investment and appears effortless. And she was working the room with the specific fluency of a woman who has spent decades learning the grammar of social performance and has become genuinely excellent at it. I watched her for a moment from the entrance before she saw me. Watched the way she moved, the way she made each person feel briefly singular, the way she laughed at exactly the right moment and touched an arm at exactly the right moment and created the impression in every person she spoke to that they were the person she had most been hoping to see. She was good at it. I have never pretended otherwise. Then she saw me. The fluency interrupted for exactly 1 beat. 1 beat of the real Tiffany. The one who threw a duffel bag off a porch, the one who said loser in a flat and bored voice to her sister standing in the rain, surfacing through the performance before the performance reclaimed her. She excused herself from the couple she was speaking with and crossed the room toward me with the smile back in place, and the eyes doing the work the smile was designed to conceal. She said, "You came." I said, "I was invited." She looked at the suit. Something moved through her expression that I had seen before. The micro-recalibration, the attempt to categorize something that wasn't fitting its expected category. She said, "You look different." I said, "I look like myself." She held my gaze for a moment, searching it the way she had searched it in the parking lot of Miller's Fuel, looking for the anger, the bitterness, the mess that she could manage or dismiss or use. Finding none of it, she said, "I want tonight to go well." I said, "It will." Something in the way I said it made her go still for just a fraction of a second. Then the program director's voice came over the room sound system, announcing that the formal program would begin and asking guests to find their seats. Tiffany looked at me once more. Then she went to the platform. I found my position near the back of the room, beside a pillar with a clear sight line to the platform and to the main entrance through which Harper and the bank representative and the court officer had entered 30 seconds behind me and taken their positions near the east wall with the specific unremarkability of people who have been trained to be present in a room without drawing attention to their presence until attention is required. The program moved through its opening elements: gratitude, community, the language of philanthropy delivered with the polished warmth of people who have given these speeches before and believe in them, and are also aware that believing in them and performing them are not always separable. Then Tiffany's introduction. A board member read it from a printed card. Entrepreneur, digital brand strategist, community contributor, steward of the Miller family legacy. Applause moved through the room with genuine warmth. She ascended the platform. And if you've been watching since the beginning, if you've been with this story from the storm and the porch and the duffel bag on the wet lawn, right now would be the moment to hit that subscribe button, because what happened in the next 4 minutes is the reason my father spent 22 years building a position instead of a weapon, and it is the most precise thing I have ever watched happen in a room. Tiffany began her remarks. Success, she said, is never a solo journey. She spoke about legacy and community and the responsibility of those who have been given much. She was composed. She was eloquent. She was, in the way she always was in rooms like this, genuinely compelling. And then Harper stepped forward. Not dramatically, not loudly, with the quiet procedural authority of a man who has filed the correct documents in the correct offices and is now simply making their existence known in the correct room. He said, "I'm afraid we need to briefly pause the program." The room shifted. Tiffany turned, and the irritation that crossed her face was reflexive and immediate before she managed it back into professional composure. She said, "Daniel, this is really not the time." He said, "I understand. I'm afraid the matter is time sensitive." He addressed the room in the tone of a man reading a record into evidence. He identified himself. He identified the pending probate proceedings. He referenced the withheld estate documents and the request for judicial review. He referenced the lien on the property. This property, he said, with a specificity that landed on the room like a weight, and the foreclosure protocols that had been activated pending resolution of the unresolved obligations. The bank representative stepped forward, professional, detached, devastating in the way that pure financial language is always devastating when delivered in a social room, because there is no emotional register available for it, no warmth that can absorb it, no performance that can reframe it. He confirmed the flagged refinancing application. He confirmed the restricted asset transfer status. He confirmed that effective immediately, no transactions involving the property could be processed pending court determination. Tiffany's composure came apart the way expensive things come apart, not with a crash, with a fracture. Precise, quiet, permanent. She said, "This is insane." Harper said, "These are filed legal proceedings." She said, "You cannot do this here." He said, "The proceedings exist regardless of location. I am making them visible." She looked at me then. Across the room, across 60 people who had arrived to honor her and were now sitting inside the collapse of the structure she had built, she looked at me with the full, unmanaged force of recognition. She said, "You did this." I did not move, did not adjust my expression. I said from across the room, in the same conversational tone I had used to tell her to drive safe in my parking lot, "Harper did this. The law did this. Dad did this. Tears broke through. Not performed, real, which was the first real thing I had seen from her in as long as I could remember, and which I noted was something that was not satisfaction and was not mercy, but was somewhere between them, in the complicated territory of watching a person you grew up with finally run out of the performance they have been sustaining at everyone else's expense. She said, I took care of him. I said, you managed him. She said, I was there. I said, you were there. And you used it. The room was absolutely still. The kind of still that only happens when 60 people simultaneously understand that they are witnessing something real in a space designed for performance, and the contrast between those two things has become too large to look away from. Tiffany's knees buckled. Not theatrical, just gravity, just the body's honest response to a reality that has finally closed the distance between itself and the person who has been running from it. She reached for the edge of the platform. A board member near the front stood, uncertain, looking between her and Harper and the bank representative and me. Donors were already reaching for their coats. The room was beginning its exit with the quiet urgency of people who understand that proximity to collapse carries its own risks. I did not cross the room to her. I did not speak again, because there was nothing left to say that the room had not already heard, and nothing left to do that the documents had not already done, and my father had not built this position for drama. He had built it for clarity, and the room had never been clearer. The guest left the way people leave a room where something irreversible has just happened, quickly, quietly, with the particular efficiency of individuals who have decided that distance is the most useful thing they can put between themselves and what they witnessed. There were no dramatic exits, no raised voices at the door, no lingering clusters of people debating what they had seen. Just coats retrieved, cars started, headlights sweeping across the lakeside property in slow arcs as the driveway emptied with a finality that felt less like an ending and more like a verdict being recorded without appeal. I stayed until the last guest left. Not because I needed to witness the full evacuation or because I wanted Tiffany to see me standing in the room after everyone else had gone, but because Harper had advised me to remain present until the court officer completed the documentation required by the procedural elements of the evening, which took 40 minutes. And leaving before that was complete would have been the first imprecise thing I had done in 9 weeks, and I was not going to introduce imprecision at the finish. Tiffany sat in a chair near the platform for most of those 40 minutes, not performing, not strategizing, not managing the room, just sitting. Her posture had changed in a way I had never seen before, not collapsed exactly, but reduced, the specific physical quality of a person whose structure has been load-bearing on a lie for so long that when the lie is removed, the body doesn't immediately know how to hold itself differently. I did not speak to her during those 40 minutes. Harper handled everything that required handling. The court officer completed his documentation. The bank representative confirmed the procedural record and left. Harper shook my hand at the door with the firm, brief grip of a man whose job is finished and who knows it, and said, "Your father would have considered this precise." I said, "I know." He said, "Call me Monday." He left. I stood in the entrance of the lakeside house, my father's house, the house I had grown up visiting on summer weekends when the water was warm, the house whose kitchen still had the same cabinet hardware from 1997, the house where I had watched my father sit at the window with his coffee every Sunday morning looking at the lake with the expression of a man who had built something and was quietly satisfied by the fact of it. And I looked at Tiffany across the empty room. She looked back at me. The catering staff had retreated to the kitchen. The flowers stood in the silence with the slightly absurd persistence of beautiful things that have survived an ugly event. She said, "What happens now?" Her voice was different. The architecture that usually supported it, the performance, the calibration, the constant real-time adjustment for audience was gone, And what was underneath it was rawer and smaller and more recognizably human than anything I had heard from her since we were children. I said, the court process continues. Harper expects a resolution timeline of 60 to 90 days, depending on disclosure compliance. She said, and the House? I said, the lien resolution will require a financial settlement. Margaret Klein's office will be in contact with your attorney about the structure. She closed her eyes briefly. Opened them. I don't have the liquidity. I said, I know. The settlement terms account for that. She looked at me with something that was not quite surprise and not quite gratitude. Something more complicated. The expression of a person receiving information that is simultaneously a relief and a further exposure of how completely they had misread the situation they were in. I said, this was never about the house, Tiffany. She said, then what was it about? I said, Dad left you a house. He left me what was underneath it. The difference between those two things is exactly the difference between how he understood each of us. And I think you know that. The silence that followed was the longest silence between us since I had arrived home. And it was different from all the previous silences, not hostile, not strategic, not loaded with the management of information. Just honest. Just two people in a room with nothing left between them except the truth of what had happened, which is the rarest and most uncomfortable kind of silence there is. I left shortly after. I drove back to Miller's Fuel on empty roads in the particular quiet of a November night in rural Pennsylvania when the cold has settled completely and the sky is clear enough to show the stars in a density that suburban light pollution usually erases. I unlocked the front door, went inside, turned on the lights, stood behind the counter for a moment in my black suit in my father's gas station, and looked at the clean shelves and the functioning register and the repaired ceiling and the floor I had swept myself on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks prior because it needed to be swept and I was there and I had a broom. Then I went to the back office, sat at my father's metal desk, took off my jacket and wrote a list. Not of what had been won, of what came next. Because winning is a moment and what comes next is a life. And my father had not built a trust instrument and a vault and a 22-year relationship with a probate attorney and a USB drive of forensic backup files so that his daughter could sit in a black suit feeling victorious. He had built it so that she could build something. The legal resolution took 71 days. I will not give you the procedural detail of every motion and counterfiling because the architecture of legal process is not the story. The outcome is the story, and the outcome was this. The estate was reopened. The withheld documents were entered into the record. The full trust instrument was activated and its assets formally transferred. The lien on the lakeside property was resolved through a structured settlement that required Tiffany to liquidate a portion of the business assets she had been carrying as collateral against her credit lines, the same credit lines that had been keeping her visible life functional while her actual financial position deteriorated beneath it. The lakeside house did not go to foreclosure. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters for the complete honesty of this account. The settlement was structured specifically to allow Tiffany to retain the property under a restructured mortgage that was sustainable given her actual income rather than her projected income, which meant she kept the house and lost the illusion that she had ever really owned it the way she claimed to. She kept the bones. The performance was gone. Her brand consultancy lost 3 of its 4 major client relationships in the 8 weeks following the auction, which is the nature of visibility-dependent businesses when the visibility becomes associated with the wrong kind of attention. 2 of the foundation board members she had cultivated for years quietly stepped back from the relationship. The county commissioner, whose photograph I had recognized in the donor listings, declined to renew a speaking engagement she had been scheduled for in the spring. None of this was anything I engineered. It was simply the social physics of a performance that had been exposed, the same physics Tiffany had spent her entire life leveraging in her own direction, now operating in reverse. The Miller Transition Fund opened in January. Registered nonprofit, properly incorporated, funded through the trust community allocation, exactly as my father had specified. Housing assistance and legal support for returning veterans in the county, job retraining referrals, a small emergency stabilization fund for people in the specific gap between service and civilian life, where I had spent that November night on a Greyhound bus watching rain blur, Ohio. We had 11 applicants in the first month. We had 34 by March. Pete Garza's nephew, a 26-year-old who had come back from 2 years in the Army with no housing and no plan, was the second person we assisted. Pete came by the station the week after to tell me, standing in the parking lot with his hands in his pockets the same way he always stood, and said simply, "Your dad would have liked this." I said, "I know." He nodded, went back to his truck. Tiffany came to Miller's Fuel in February. I have told you this already in the version of the story you have been watching, which is the version that is true. She came, she was thinner, the SUV was gone. She stood outside for a long time before she came in, and when she said she was sorry, the words were raw and late and real. I gave her a shift schedule, not because I had forgiven everything, or because the years of dismissal and the word on the porch and the 14 months I spent grieving my father from 12,000 feet had been erased by an apology, but because my father had left me something beyond the trust and the vault and the position. He had left me the understanding that the purpose of having power is not to hold it over the people who underestimated you. It is to use it to build something they couldn't see coming. Miller's Fuel is open 6 days a week. The sign still reads Miller's FL because I have decided I like it. It reminds me that things do not need to be perfect to function, that something can be missing a letter or two and still light up the road for people who need a place to stop. My father built this place with his hands over 40 years, and he left it to me knowing I would understand what it was. And I think about that every morning when I unlock the front door and turn on the lights and stand behind the counter in the quiet before the first customer comes in. He didn't leave me a house. He left me a foundation. And I wonder sometimes, sitting with that, thinking about everything it took to get here and everything that was lost along the way and everything that was found at the bottom of a hatch in a storage room floor. I wonder what he would have done differently if he had said it while he was alive, instead of leaving it in a vault for me to find alone in the dark. What would you have said to him if you'd had the chance? Tell me in the comments. I want to know.